Los Angeles, March 1969. The Hollywood Palladium glittered under massive chandeliers as the entertainment industry's most legendary figures gathered for the inaugural Comedy Hall of Fame induction ceremony. 400 of Hollywood's biggest names filled every seat, from vaudeville veterans to television's newest stars, all assembled to honor the pioneers who had shaped American humor. At table 23, sat Dick Van Dyke, confident and comfortable in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, that warm smile brightening conversations with Carol Burnett, Tim Conway, and Harvey Korman as they discussed the evolution of television comedy. The evening should have been pure celebration for Dick. The Dick Van Dyke Show had concluded its historic run the previous year, leaving behind a legacy that had redefined what television comedy could achieve. Critics were calling it the greatest sitcom ever produced. Emmy Awards lined his mantelpiece, and Dick had become the undisputed king of television entertainment. But at the head table, preparing to accept a Lifetime Achievement Award, sat Bob Hope. Bob was comedy royalty in 1969, a performer whose career spanned 5 decades and every entertainment medium that had ever existed. From vaudeville to radio, from films to television, from nightclub stages to military bases around the world, Bob Hope had conquered them all. His USO shows for American troops had made him a patriotic icon. His road movies with Bing Crosby had defined comedy partnerships, and his television specials drew audiences that most performers could only dream of. But Bob was also a man whose massive ego had grown alongside his legendary status. At 66, he was increasingly sensitive to suggestions that his era was ending, that younger comedians were taking over, that his style was becoming outdated, and lately he'd been watching Dick Van Dyke's meteoric rise with growing irritation. The problem wasn't just Dick's success, it was the nature of that success. Critics were calling Dick innovative, groundbreaking, revolutionary. They were suggesting that television comedy had reached new heights of sophistication under Dick's influence. To Bob's mind, this was both insulting and historically ignorant. Real comedy had been perfected decades ago by performers like him who had earned their stripes in front of live audiences under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Bob had been drinking moderately throughout the elegant dinner, his famous quick wit slightly sharpened by alcohol and the growing realization that this ceremony was essentially celebrating his transition from active legend to historical figure. He'd been listening to conversations about television's bright future, about how the medium was evolving, about how performers like Dick Van Dyke were pushing comedy into new territories. Dick, meanwhile, was genuinely honored to be among comedy legends. He felt humbled by the company, grateful for his success, and excited about comedy's future possibilities. When people mentioned Bob Hope, Dick spoke with enormous respect about the older comedian's contributions to American entertainment, about how Bob had shown that comedians could be both entertainers and patriotic figures. But Bob interpreted Dick's presence and recognition differently. What Bob saw was a television performer who had achieved success without paying the dues that real comedians had to pay. Someone who was being praised for innovation when he was really just adapting techniques that Bob and his generation had perfected years earlier. The formal program began at 9 o'clock with inductions of various comedy pioneers. George Burns received thunderous applause, Jack Benny was honored posthumously, and the atmosphere remained warm and celebratory. When Dick was called to present the Innovation in Comedy Award, the applause was genuine and enthusiastic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dick began, his voice carrying easily through the elegant ballroom, "tonight we're celebrating something remarkable, the continuous evolution of American comedy, from vaudeville stages to television screens." He paused, looking around at faces that had shaped entertainment for decades. Comedy has always been about adaptation, about finding new ways to make people laugh while honoring the techniques developed by the masters who came before us. When I watch Bob Hope perform, I see timing that was perfected in vaudeville, delivery that was refined in radio, and presence that was tested in front of the toughest audiences in the world, our servicemen overseas. Dick's speech was generous and humble, acknowledging the foundation laid by established comedy legends. The beautiful thing about comedy, Dick continued, is that each generation builds on what came before while finding their own voice. Bob Hope showed us that comedians could be both entertainers and public figures, that humor could serve both commercial and patriotic purposes, that timing was everything and presence was irreplaceable. Bob's table had gone quiet. Several people glanced at him, trying to gauge his reaction to being mentioned with such obvious admiration. What I've learned from legends like Bob Hope, Dick concluded, is that real comedy isn't just about getting laughs. It's about connecting with audiences, making them feel better about themselves and their world. Television may be a newer medium, but the goals are exactly the same as they were in vaudeville. Find the truth, make it funny, and help people forget their troubles for a while. Dick received warm applause and returned to his table as the evening continued. But Bob's mood had darkened considerably. Being mentioned in Dick's speech felt patronizing to him, as if this television newcomer was graciously acknowledging the old masters while positioning himself as their natural successor. As the formal program neared its end with Bob's Lifetime Achievement presentation, his careful public persona began to slip. He took the microphone with the commanding presence that had captivated audiences for 5 decades, but there was an edge to his demeanor that his closest friends recognized as dangerous. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bob began, his voice carrying that distinctive rhythm that had made him famous, "I want to talk about what real comedy actually requires, because I think we've lost sight of that in all our excitement about new mediums and new approaches." The room settled into attentive silence. This was Bob Hope, America's comedian, about to share wisdom from 5 decades of entertainment. "Real comedy," Bob continued, "isn't learned in television studios with multiple takes and editing rooms where you can fix your mistakes. Real comedy is learned in front of live audiences who either laugh or they don't, who either connect with you or they walk away." Several people nodded, expecting this to be a thoughtful reflection on the differences between live performance and television. "I've performed for audiences in every condition imaginable," Bob said, his voice getting stronger and more pointed. "I've entertained troops in combat zones. I've worked crowds in the rain. I've made people laugh when they were tired, scared, homesick, and desperate for any kind of relief from their reality." Bob began to pace slightly, his movements sharp and calculated. "And I did it without retakes, without script doctors standing by to fix my mistakes, without producers who could edit out the parts that didn't work. That's real comedy training. That's how you learn to be a genuine entertainer." The atmosphere in the Palladium was beginning to shift as people sensed this was heading beyond nostalgic reflection. "Now, I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings," Bob continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I think it's important that we maintain some perspective about what genuine comedy expertise actually looks like versus what just happens to work well on television." Bob looked directly toward Dick's table. "Take Dick Van Dyke, for example," Bob said, his voice carrying that perfectly timed delivery that could make any statement sound reasonable. "Everyone's calling him a comedy innovator, praising his television success, talking about how he's revolutionized entertainment." The ballroom went completely silent. 400 people stopped moving, stopped drinking, stopped breathing as they realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. "But let's be honest about what Dick Van Dyke actually represents," Bob continued, his voice getting sharper and more cutting. "Dick is a television amateur. He's someone who learned to be funny in a controlled environment where every element could be adjusted to make him look good." Dick's face remained composed, but something in his eyes was beginning to change. "Has Dick Van Dyke ever had to make troops laugh when they were facing combat the next morning?" Bob asked rhetorically. "Has he ever had to win over a crowd that didn't want to be entertained? Has he ever had to prove his comedy skills under real pressure, where failure meant disappointing people who desperately needed to laugh?" Bob's voice was getting more theatrical, more condescending. "The answer is no. Dick Van Dyke has worked in the comfortable world of television studios, with professional writers, multiple takes, and editing that can make anyone look funny. That's not real comedy training. That's amateur hour with professional production values. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This had crossed from industry commentary into personal attack territory. Dick Van Dyke's success is very impressive for television, Bob said with dismissive laughter. But that's not the same as being a real comedian. Real comedians earn their stripes in front of live audiences under difficult conditions. Television performers just need to be pleasant enough for cameras and lucky enough to have good writers. Bob looked directly at Dick. So when I hear people calling Dick the future of comedy, when I see him receiving awards for innovation, I have to speak up, because real comedy innovation requires real comedy training. And Dick Van Dyke is just a television amateur who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right production team. The silence that followed was unlike anything anyone in the Palladium had ever experienced. 400 people held their breath, waiting to see how Dick Van Dyke would respond to this devastating public attack from America's comedian. Dick stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and calm. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent room. "Bob," Dick said simply, "are you finished?" "I'm finished when someone acknowledges the difference between real comedy training and just being successful on television," Bob replied, his voice still carrying that distinctive confidence. Dick walked to the center of the room, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. His movement was confident, unhurried, like a man who knew exactly what he intended to say. "All right," Dick said, his voice growing stronger. "Let's talk about real comedy training versus using comedy for personal gain. Let's talk about what it means to serve audiences versus what it means to use audiences. And let's talk about the difference between being a professional entertainer and being someone who exploits the platform that entertainment provides." Bob crossed his arms, his expression suggesting he was prepared for whatever defense Dick might offer. "Bob, you called me a television amateur?" Dick continued. "You suggested that I haven't earned my success through real comedy training, that I benefited from controlled conditions rather than proving myself under pressure, that television success doesn't equal genuine comedy expertise." Dick looked around the room, making eye contact with various comedy legends. "Those are serious accusations, and I think everyone here deserves to understand what they really mean." Dick turned back to Bob, his voice becoming more pointed. "First, let's talk about what comedy training actually requires. You're absolutely right that performing for live audiences teaches skills that television can't replicate. The immediate feedback, the need to adjust in real time, the pressure of connecting with people who have other options for their entertainment, those are valuable experiences." Several people in the audience began nodding. "But Bob, comedy training isn't just about where you perform. It's about why you perform. And I think it's time we talked about the difference between entertaining troops and exploiting them." The room was completely focused on Dick now. "You want to talk about USO shows and entertaining servicemen under difficult conditions? Let's talk about them. Let's talk about what happened during your Pacific tour in 1967. Bob's face began to change color. "Tell them about Tommy Patterson, Bob," Dick said quietly. Several people in the audience leaned forward, clearly recognizing this reference but unsure of the details. "No? You don't want to tell them?" Dick asked. "Then I will." Dick turned to address the room. During Bob's 1967 USO tour, he was performing for troops in Vietnam. One of his supporting acts was a young comedian named Tommy Patterson, a soldier who'd been drafted out of comedy clubs and was trying to maintain his career while serving his country. Dick's voice was getting harder now. Tommy was good, really good. Good enough that he was getting bigger laughs than Bob during some of the shows. And Bob noticed. Audible gasps came from several people in the audience. So Bob made a decision. Dick continued, his voice getting more passionate. He told the USO organizers that Tommy was disrupting the show's flow and needed to be removed from the tour. He said that having two comedians was confusing for the troops and that the shows needed to focus on established entertainment. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Tommy Patterson was sent back to regular combat duty. Dick continued, his voice getting louder and more commanding. a 23-year-old comedian who was bringing laughter to troops in a war zone, was returned to active combat because Bob Hope couldn't handle being upstaged. Dick walked closer to Bob. But here's what really shows your character, Bob. When Tommy's commanding officer asked if you'd be willing to write a recommendation for Tommy to continue doing USO work with other entertainers, you said no. You said he was unprofessional and not ready for military entertainment. The room was absolutely riveted. You want to know how I found out about Tommy Patterson, Bob? Because he wrote to me from Vietnam 6 months later. He'd heard that I visited military bases sometimes, and he wanted to know if I'd consider recommending him for entertainment duty if he survived his tour. Dick paused, letting his words sink in. So I looked into his case. I talked to other comedians who'd worked with him. I spoke with USO coordinators who remembered the situation. And you know what I learned? Tommy Patterson was removed from entertainment duty because he was funnier than Bob Hope. And Bob Hope couldn't tolerate that. Dick looked around the room one final time. You called me a television amateur, Bob. But the real difference between us isn't where we learned comedy. It's why we do comedy. I do comedy to make people laugh. You do comedy to make yourself look important. And when someone threatens that importance, you destroy them. The silence that followed was deafening. Bob Hope stood there, his face a mixture of rage, humiliation, and something that might have been recognition of the truth. Then something happened that no one in the Palladium expected. Bob's legs buckled, and he dropped to his knees. At first, people thought he was having some kind of medical episode. Several people moved to help him. But then they realized what was happening. Bob Hope, America's comedian, was kneeling, deliberately, in front of Dick Van Dyke, in front of 400 people. "You're right," Bob whispered, his voice barely audible. "God help me, you're right." Dick looked down at this legendary figure on his knees. This man who had entertained millions of people, now reduced to someone confronting his own cruelty. "Bob," Dick said gently. "Get up." "I can't," Bob said, tears beginning to stream down his face. "I can't get up. What I did to Tommy, to all the young performers I pushed aside because I was afraid of being shown up. I never thought about what my selfishness was doing to their lives." "Yes, you did," Dick said quietly. "You knew exactly what you were doing. But Bob, that doesn't mean you can't choose to do better." Dick knelt down beside Bob, bringing himself to eye level. "The question isn't whether you've used your position to hurt other performers," Dick said. "The question is what you're going to do now." Bob looked at Dick through his tears. "How can I fix this? How can I make it right with Tommy, with all the young comedians I sabotaged because I was too insecure to share the stage?" "You start by acknowledging what you did," Dick said. "You stop using your legend status to destroy other people's dreams and start using it to help them achieve their own dreams. You choose to lift people up instead of tearing them down." Bob nodded shakily. "I will. I swear I will." "Don't swear to me," Dick said. "Swear to Tommy Patterson. Swear to every young performer who's ever been destroyed by an established star who couldn't handle competition." Dick helped Bob to his feet. The room watched in amazement as the two comedians stood facing each other. "I need to find Tommy," Bob said, his voice stronger now. "I need to see if he made it home, if there's anything I can do to help him rebuild what I destroyed." "Yes, you do," Dick agreed. "But Bob, when you contact him, don't do it for your own guilt. Do it because he deserved better from you, because he was a fellow comedian trying to serve his country, and you used your power to hurt him instead of help him." Bob turned to address the room, his voice shaking but clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you all an enormous apology. I owe Dick Van Dyke an enormous apology. And I owe Tommy Patterson and every young performer I've hurt the biggest apology of my life." Bob's voice got stronger as he continued. "I came here tonight thinking I was defending the integrity of real comedy training, but I was really just protecting my own territory, my own ego, my own fear of being replaced by someone better than me. Dick Van Dyke didn't need to be torn down for me to maintain my status. His success didn't diminish my legacy. My own cruelty did that." Bob looked directly at Dick. "You're not a television amateur. You're a genuine entertainer who understands that comedy is about serving audiences, not using them. Everything I forgot in my pursuit of being irreplaceable." The applause that followed was unlike anything the Palladium had ever heard. It wasn't just appreciation for entertainment, it was recognition of genuine human transformation happening in real time. Bob turned back to the audience one final time. "I'm going to do better. I'm going to use whatever influence I have left to help young comedians instead of destroying them. And I'm going to spend whatever time I have remaining trying to earn the forgiveness I don't deserve." Over the next several months, the story dominated entertainment news. But the real story wasn't about humiliation or public confrontation. The real story was about accountability, change, and the possibility that even the most legendary performers could learn to use their power more responsibly. Bob did find Tommy Patterson, who had survived Vietnam and was working as a mechanic in Ohio, his comedy dreams abandoned after the USO rejection. Bob not only apologized, but helped Tommy rebuild his entertainment career, using his connections to get Tommy bookings and his influence to ensure other young comedians received fair treatment. Years later, when Bob Hope died in 2003, Dick Van Dyke spoke at his memorial service about the transformation he'd witnessed. "Bob Hope taught me that calling someone out on their behavior isn't about winning or losing. It's about caring enough about them and about the people they're hurting to tell them the truth, even when that truth is devastating to hear." The story of that night in 1969 became more than just an entertainment industry anecdote. It became a template for accountability and how established performers treat emerging talent, proving that even the most beloved entertainers need to be held responsible for how they use their power. Dick Van Dyke's calm response didn't just put Bob Hope on his knees, it helped him stand back up as the kind of comedian he'd always claimed to be, but had forgotten how to actually be. But the transformation that began that night at the Hollywood Palladium had consequences that reached far beyond the entertainment industry. Bob's commitment to supporting young talent became a model for how legendary performers could use their influence responsibly, focusing on legacy building rather than territory protection. 4 weeks after the confrontation, Bob made a decision that shocked the USO and the entertainment industry. He announced that he was establishing the Patterson Foundation, a program dedicated to supporting military personnel who had entertainment backgrounds and wanted to continue performing while serving their country. "I spent decades thinking that sharing the stage diminished my own importance," Bob told Variety in a rare personal interview. "But Dick Van Dyke taught me that the most important thing a legend can do is create more legends, not destroy them before they have a chance to develop." Bob also made a public statement about Tommy Patterson specifically, acknowledging his role in ending Tommy's USO career and taking full responsibility for what he called a shameful abuse of power, motivated by my own insecurity. The Foundation's first project was tracking down every performer that Bob had pushed aside during his USO years and offering them opportunities to revive their entertainment careers. Bob personally called each one, apologizing and asking what he could do to help repair the damage his ego had caused. Tommy Patterson's story became the Foundation's flagship case. When Bob found him working as a mechanic in Akron, Ohio, Tommy was initially suspicious of the contact. "Mr. Hope told me I wasn't professional enough for military entertainment," Tommy said during their first phone conversation. "Why would he want to help me now?" Bob's response became a model for genuine accountability. "Because I was wrong. Because you deserved better. Because I let my fear of being upstaged destroy a fellow comedian's dreams. And because spending the rest of my career trying to make that right is the least I can do." The conversation lasted 4 hours, with Bob listening as Tommy explained how the USO rejection had destroyed his confidence and led him to abandon comedy entirely. Bob didn't make excuses or try to justify his past behavior. He simply acknowledged the damage and asked what he could do to help repair it. Within 6 months, Tommy was back on stage. Bob used his connections to get Tommy bookings at major comedy clubs, appeared with him at several events to publicly endorse his talent, and even hired him as a writer for some of his television specials. "Working with Tommy taught me something I should have learned 40 years ago," Bob reflected in a 1971 interview. Helping other comedians succeed doesn't diminish your own success. It multiplies it. When Tommy gets a laugh, I feel prouder than when I get the laugh myself. The transformation also changed how the USO operated. Bob worked with military entertainment coordinators to establish policies protecting performers from the kind of arbitrary removal he had imposed on Tommy. The new guidelines required documented reasons for any changes to entertainment lineups and created appeal processes for performers who felt they'd been treated unfairly. Dick Van Dyke's role in Bob's transformation didn't go unnoticed in Hollywood. Other performers began using what became known as the Van Dyke method, confronting problematic behavior in established stars not with aggressive attacks, but with calm presentations of fact and appeals to their better natures. The method proved effective in several high-profile cases. When a legendary director was discovered to be systematically sabotaging young actors' careers out of jealousy, a group of performers used Dick's approach to confront him privately, leading to public acknowledgement and changed behavior. In 1972, 3 years after the Palladium confrontation, Bob and Dick collaborated on a television special called Comedy Generations. The show featured Bob teaching young comedians techniques he'd developed over 5 decades, while Dick demonstrated how those classical techniques could be adapted for television. Working with Bob now is completely different from meeting him that first night, Dick told TV Guide during the special's production. The person he's allowed himself to become is so much more valuable than the legend he was trying to protect. Bob's response revealed the depth of his transformation. Dick saved my legacy by forcing me to confront what I was doing to it. I thought protecting my status meant destroying potential rivals, but real status comes from building something bigger than yourself. The special was both a ratings success and a critical triumph, praised for its demonstration of how different generations of comedians could learn from each other rather than compete destructively. Bob's later USO shows also evolved dramatically. Instead of solo performances designed to showcase his own supremacy, they became variety shows featuring multiple comedians and entertainers. Bob positioned himself as a host and mentor rather than the sole attraction, using his platform to introduce audiences to emerging talent. These collaborative shows proved more successful than his previous solo efforts, drawing larger audiences and receiving more positive reviews. Military personnel particularly appreciated the variety and the opportunity to see both established legends and fresh faces. When the Vietnam War ended, Bob continued the collaborative approach in his domestic performances. His television specials began featuring regular segments spotlighting young comedians, and he used his industry influence to create opportunities for performers who might otherwise have struggled to get noticed. The entertainment industry took notice of Bob's transformation, and it influenced how other legendary performers approached their relationships with emerging talent. The Hope model, using established status to lift others rather than protect territory, became a recognized approach to legacy management. In 1985, when Bob was receiving a Kennedy Center honor for Lifetime Achievement in Entertainment, Dick Van Dyke was invited to speak about their relationship and its impact on the industry. "Bob Hope taught me something important about confrontation," Dick told the Kennedy Center audience. "When you care about someone enough to tell them they're hurting people, and when you do it with the goal of helping them become better rather than destroying them, that's not conflict, that's love." Dick looked at Bob, who was sitting in the honorees box with tears in his eyes. Bob spent the first 60 years of his career being one kind of legend, the kind that stands alone at the top. But he spent his final 30 years being a different kind of legend, the kind that builds a mountain for others to climb. The Kennedy Center audience gave Bob a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes, not just for his entertainment achievements, but for his transformation into a mentor and supporter of other performers. When Bob Hope died in 2003 at age 100, his memorial service featured dozens of comedians whose careers he had supported after his transformation. Tommy Patterson, by then a successful comedy writer and performer, delivered a eulogy that captured the real lesson of that night in 1969. "Bob Hope made a terrible mistake when he destroyed my USO career. But then he spent 30 years proving that people can change, that legends can learn to use their power better, and that the most important thing about making a mistake is what you do after you realize you've made it. Tommy looked out at the audience of entertainment figures. Dick Van Dyke confronted Bob Hope about his treatment of young performers, not because he wanted to destroy a legend, but because he wanted to save one. And in saving Bob, he saved all of us who benefited from the man Bob chose to become. The story of Bob Hope, calling Dick Van Dyke a television amateur, had become one of Hollywood's most important transformation narratives. It proved that even the most established, beloved, and powerful figures could learn to use their influence more responsibly when confronted with the consequences of their actions. More importantly, it demonstrated that accountability didn't have to mean destruction. Dick's approach, presenting facts calmly, appealing to better nature, and offering the possibility of redemption, had created change that lasted for decades and influenced an entire industry's understanding of how legends should treat emerging talent. The Hollywood Palladium that night had witnessed more than just a confrontation between two comedians. It had witnessed the birth of a new model for how power should be used in entertainment, not to protect territory, but to expand it for everyone who deserved a chance to succeed.